All right. Hello, composers, arrangers, instrumentalists, people who are curious about composing and arranging for various groups. And today I'm talking about the brass choir in general, of course, including the horn, trumpet, trombone, tuba. This is a compilation from various textbooks. Let's start with the Sam Adler. He makes a good point that originally the brass, of course, were outdoor instruments used for hunting, military functions, or announcements of civil disasters. And of course, all of us are thinking back to perhaps you're thinking of a movie or a play, or perhaps a piece of music that references a kind of far off trumpet or horn announcing the arrival of an army, for example. Well, that's historically accurate. It was started, we used these instruments starting in the 16th century for trumpet fanfares. In general, you'll find that the brass are a more homogeneous group of instruments than the woodwind choir. This is why I spend more time on the woodwind choir in general, because the instruments get along a little less well. We need to know more about their specifics in order for them to blend well, or in order for them to be heard against each other. Well, actually, the brass get along quite nicely. What we often have, though, are cases of horns versus trumpets, trombones, tubas, just because the horn is a more delicate instrument. You could say the same of the tuba in some ways, but you would often say, well, the horns can get lost in this mix. So we'll talk about how to balance the horn versus trumpets or trombones. One thing that you should know, of course, is well, we can picture the resulting sound, but what is it that goes into the instrument that makes the resulting sound? Well, it starts with, of course, a buzz produced by your embouchure, and that buzz will be pressed up against the mouthpiece. And you can see on these various mouthpieces just the great difference between a French horn player and those of trumpet, trombone, tuba. You can see that the funnel shaped mouthpiece is better for blending, and the resulting sound is warmer, rounder. And we have the other mouthpieces, which are cup like. You could also say, well, I'll talk a bit about the similarities between horn and tuba, but you can see that the horn stands out from the beginning, from the very first apparatus that the buzz goes through. Typical numbers in brass choir. Try to picture the orchestra. How many of each player do you have? Can you picture a typical horn section? You probably said four. You can think of it as soprano, alto, tenor, bass. In fact, the range of the French horn is roughly the range of the human voice within a limited context. Let's say a community choir would have, F to F, which is it's very conservative range for a choir, but that covers a good amount of the human singing range. So you can think in terms of SATB. What about number of trumpets? Well, they wish it were 10, but no, usually three trumpets, and that might include C trumpets or B flat trumpets, maybe a mix, depending on the piece, or perhaps younger players. If you have younger players, they tend to start with B flat instruments. Of course, in concert band, you can have a mix. In professional orchestra, well, you could call for all kinds of different trumpets, but you have typically three trumpeters. Okay, here you have one person playing three trumpets. I wouldn't recommend this, but amazing that this is possible. What about the number of trombones? If you said 76 trombones, well, you'd be referencing one of my favorite musicals from when I was a child. But no, sadly, it's only three trombones, and usually one of those is the bass trombone. So you have two tenor trombones, one bass trombone. And how many tubas? Well, sadly, usually just one per group. It is an elite group of musicians, the tuba players, and usually you just find one. Of course, there are exceptions, and you can write a piece if you have a bigger ensemble. Certainly, you can enlarge this if you have the option and you're given as many brass as you want. Remember that you want, in general, more horns to compensate for the other instruments. So let's say if you added more trumpets, for example, I'm thinking of Wagner now, who might have as many as 8 or 10 or 12 horn players to balance out the rest of the group. This is from your Bladder textbook. So means of producing sound. Let's get down to the basics. Of course, it starts with the lips vibrating, producing a buzz. The tubing is made of brass, of course. We call them brass instruments. Makes sense. Try to picture the shape from the beginning of the horn to the end of the horn. So French horn, flugelhorns, and tubas all have blank bores. What do you think? Is it cylindrical or conical? It is conical. It flares out towards the end. So in general, it's starting with a smaller diameter and it's enlarging towards the end. Of course, all of them have a flare at the bell. So this is kind of a misnomer if you're just picturing the bell, but we're talking about the entire tubing. The tubing is getting larger and larger throughout the bell. What about trumpets? Trumpets and trombones? Well, they mostly have cylindrical bores, meaning the diameter at the beginning of the tubing is roughly the same towards the end, and of course it flares out at the end at the bell. So we're thinking about, okay, what's the difference between the instruments? Why is it that horns tend to be more fragile, a little bit more quiet, but certainly more dark? Same goes for flugelhorns, same goes for tubas. Why do they tend to be just softer around the edges? Well, it has to do with of course, the cup versus funnel mouthpiece, and also the sense of, well, what is the tubing? Okay, so now you have a good answer for when a child raises their hand and says, Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so, why is it that the tuba sounds different than the trombone? Why doesn't everyone just play trombones? Well, now you have a good answer. All tubing has flares out at the end, as we said. Okay, of course, the lip tension changes the different notes that you're able to produce. So when we're changing the tension, we're accessing different partials. So if we started with let's say a low pedal C, that's the octave, fifth, it's a perfect fourth above that. And of course we can keep extending that, but those are the first 7 partials of the overtone series. And this is exactly what all brass are doing when they are changing the lip tension. They're accessing different partials from the fundamental. Well, why is it that they need fingering for their valves? Well, that has to do with changing the length of the tube. So it's, in a sense, you're creating a different fundamental so that you're able to create different pitches or melodies. Of course, if you picture the original, let's say the trumpet, the valveless trumpet, natural. Right? We're picturing, let's say, a military call to action. Well, that's because they didn't have all these other notes. They didn't have those seconds. They weren't able to play a C major scale from that fundamental. So it's a very natural thing that we have these sort of horn calls and trumpet calls. Historically, these were the only notes that were available to play. Of course, with the addition of valves, we can add notes that are possible. Tuning slides that are for fine tuning. So as in certain partials will be out of tune, so you'll want to raise or lower them. This is the kind of thing that you need to know if you're teaching brass. It's not the kind of thing you need to know if you're an arranger. Okay, in terms of articulations, you can think of these as being essentially similar to woodwind articulations, with some slight differences. They can single, double, triple tongue. All of this is par for the course. Of course, it's not too typical to have, let's say, triple tongue for French horn, which tends to be oh, just it speaks a little bit more slowly. Same with the tuba, but certainly you can call for that, and the resulting sound though might not be as crisp than, let's say, if you gave the same thing to the trumpets or the trombones. Okay, so it will, let's say, a staccato of double tongue taka 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 ta, or taka 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 ta, will speak a little bit more clearly in the trumpets and trombones. What about flutter? Is flutter possible? Well, in general, for brass instruments, they're going to be producing a similar sound by growling at the same time as playing. So it will have a similar effect, essentially like a tremolo. A shake is specific to horn players. I should say brass players. It tends to be for trumpet, really, and that's a specific sound in the jazz world, jazz band writing usually. Certainly, it's literally what they're doing is shaking the instrument back and forth. You can also produce the same sound in several different ways. So you can just say shake if you want that sound. But growl is certainly possible for all. Trombonists use various legato tonguings due to the nature of the slide. Again, this is not something you necessarily need to know, but just know that they're certainly able to play legato just like everyone else. The way they produce it is slightly different due to, if you picture the trombone, the slide trombone, well, of course, they're accessing, instead of valves, they're accessing different lengths of tubing by extending out farther. So they're making the tubing longer so that they can access different fundamentals. This makes it possible for them to play a scale versus only the overtone series based on one fundamental. Okay, this is from Grantham. And this is good advice. Take note, if the dynamic marking is mezzo forte or louder, 2 horns are needed to balance 1 trumpet or trombone. I would write that down. Make sure you know that in general, you just need more sound from the French horns. If you have 1-to-1, 1 horn against 1 trumpet, well, you're going to be lopsided. If you want them in a supporting role, which often they are, well, that might be okay. But even still, you'll hear that they have a way of disappearing into the background. So be careful of the balance. At a softer dynamic, 1 horn can balance with 1 trumpet, depending on the range of the trumpet, trombone, and I would say depending on the skill of the trumpeter and trombone. So if you're dealing with younger kids and you're lucky enough to have a full brass ensemble, well, probably good for you. You have a great funding probably. And if you have French horns, which is a little rare for younger players, but that would be great if you have that opportunity. Well, I would say you will be lopsided because the trumpets and the trombones will have trouble controlling their breath to produce a true piano sound the same way, let's say a professional might. Okay, avoid expecting the brass to enter on a high note. Okay, a high C. Can they play it? Well, of course, a trumpet player can play a high C, but it would be much more playable if you gave them a note before. Right? Such entrances are risky. Lead up to that note by scale, or at least give the chance to leap up a fifth. So you can try. Much more playable than just, or even better. Okay, a scale leading up to that high note. Okay, spacing in chordal harmony. This is from Rimsky-Korsakov. Still a good source for us, even though the orchestra has been updated since he was alive to include new techniques. Be careful of close spacing in the low range. This is great advice. Spacing resembling the harmonic series will sound resonant. Okay, so we're still talking about the harmonic series in terms of, well, stacking up horns on top of each other. Sounds very resonant, doesn't it? The octave, fifth, perfect fourth, It's very powerful. If you were to take those same notes and put them all in the lowest range, technically it's playable. You're getting a very fat, a very thick sound in the low register. Maybe you want that sound. Maybe you want a kind of, if you're creating the effect of a foghorn, let's say. Well, that would really create that thickness of that sound. If you want a really clear but powerful sound, I would suggest larger spacing in the low register. And again, this has to do with the harmonic series. Okay, here are some other options. Same idea where you have bigger spacing down below. Horny meaning horns, 4 horns. Okay, special attacks and alterations to sustain notes. So brass are capable of creating a variety of attacks and sustain. I'm sorry, wrong octave. Essentially treat them like you would the woodwind, in that every time we see the beginning of a phrase, we're thinking of a new attack. Ta 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 ta. In fact, you might even go through and sing the melody. Try to reproduce with your own breath. See where you need to breathe. Ta 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 ta. In fact, if it were me, I think I would probably get rid of this tie and just make that a 16th note rest, a 16th rest, excuse me. Why bother writing the rest when they need to breathe anyway? So I'm a fan of being as explicit as you can. Write in the rest, give them the space to breathe. Okay, but this was good. This composer was obviously aware that they need breath, and he or she is instructing where to put that breath. Okay, special brass effects and devices. Vibrato is popular in jazz styles, not considered a normal part. Okay, I can't produce it all that well on a MIDI instrument. But of course, you can call for it. So if you do want vibrato, if that's in your creative mind's eye, well, write it. You can say molto vibrato, poco vibrato, or non vibrato if you want a really clear straight tone. You can also say straight tone. In general, they will play with a straight tone in a classical setting, in a concert setting. In a jazz setting, they would most likely, in a soloistic role, they would add that vibrato. But if you hear it, mark it down. I think it's good to be explicit. To produce vibrato, this can be made from the diaphragm, as in changing from the stomach the amount of air. You can also produce the same thing from the jaw, or mechanical, which means usually from the valves. So they can press the valve and gently shake the valve back and forth, and you hear a little warble in tone. So any of these, a combination of them, can be used for vibrato. The other most common, if you can picture the trombone, we can get that same effect by just gently sliding the slide back and forth. You get the same effect. Of course, is this something we need to know as arrangers? Well, the main thing you need to know, if you hear it, put it on the page: vibrato, molto vibrato, poco vibrato, or non-vibrato, if you want that specific sound. Lip trills, again, we've talked about this in the world of horn. This is more typical for French horn. They are able to produce essentially higher partials, going back and forth between two different notes quickly, in quick succession. This is suggestive of early music, back when before we had the advent of valves. So it's something you can use. Again, if you want that sound, write it lip trill. In general, though, if you write a trill, it will be more easily produced with the valve. So I would stick with that personally. Shakes, again, I already mentioned the idea of lip trill versus shaking. You're literally shaking the horn to produce that. Okay, glissandi, plural of glissando. Same idea where you can produce this with the valve. So they push down the valve halfway, and you can hear a slight change. Remember, every time you access a valve, you're making the length of the tubing longer, so it's going to lower the pitch. So they can just press ever so slightly, and it has the sense of falling off. In fact, this is quite a common technique for jazz players, falling off of a note. The harmonic series, this is a great trick. Right, this is glissing into a note through the harmonic series. It's also called a rip. This is very common for horns. So if you ask a whole horn section to rip together, you can literally write the word rip, and mark this with a glissando line. It's very effective. It's a great dramatic effect. So keep that in mind if you're looking for something exciting in the brass section. Okay, slide glissando. Which do you think out of all the brass? I know which one you're picturing. Of course, the technique of the trombone. So, how far can they gliss? Well, they can only gliss as far as the length of their arm, which can extend, which is the length of a tritone. So they cannot gliss more than that. In fact, I would say, in general, unless you really know your trombone, you can refer to the back of the book, which refers to which notes you can gliss from. But if you just leave it indeterminate and you just say gliss, and you have the little line that says gliss, GLISS period, this is better, and because they'll just go down to the lowest position and come back up. Unless you really know your positions, and you can say, okay, gliss from this note to this note, because it may or may not be possible. Okay, another way is just ask your trombonist friend or colleague what's possible. Okay, brassy tone, also called cuivre, schmettern, or metallici. I'm in the habit of saying brassy, but you can also say cuivre. It is, so this is this is a pretty good MIDI instrument where if I press as hard as I can, it's really getting quite a brassy sound, which is kind of a raucous sound. And that is a loud dynamic. Bells up, this is a great trick, and sometimes I should say it's a good technique. It's more than a trick, it's a good technique. If you want a little bit more power, let's say everyone's playing fortissimo already, but you want more sound, well, everyone's playing into their stand. Even the horn players, well, you can picture the bell is facing back, but if you can have the French horn stand up and they'll raise their horn. It does produce more sound. Same with the trumpets. In a concert setting, they're usually sitting and playing into the stand or just to the side of the stand. If you want bells up, well, they can literally point their bells towards the audience. Okay, this can produce additional excitement and point directly towards the audience, as I said. Some brass effects, which are great, and this might be fun to incorporate. Let's say you want some sound effects. You can have them whisper into the horn, as in whisper words, blow air through the horn, whistle into the tuba. Why not? If you want to create a spooky Halloween song for your young ensemble, or maybe you're writing a modern music piece and you want to explore extended techniques, well, these are great options for you. Smacking sound, smacking the lips against the mouthpiece, and creates kind of a percussive sound. Something to explore. Timbral trills. This means that it's the same note being produced with different fingering. Same note, different fingering. So you'll hear usually a slight difference in tone or tuning, sometimes both. So you're getting the same note, but you're trilling on the exact same note. So it has a sense of movement and excitement. Okay, and clicks. These are clicks made from the valves without pushing air through the instrument. And lastly, microtones, which are between the notes, and multiphonics, which involves singing through your instrument at the same time, usually singing a different pitch. So let's say you're holding a pitch. La. It sounds very clear when I just sing it, but if you do this through a horn, it will create quite a interesting effect where you're accessing, the partials. It's hard to describe. It's just a very unique sound. So I'd ask your brass playing friend, hey, can you sing through your instrument as you play, and you'll hear this incredible sound from the instrument. Okay, brass mutes. We'll finish up with the mutes today, and these are very important, very common in the brass world. The straight mute made of metal, a cup mute, which is colorless, creates a nasal sound. Both of these are very common and produce a good amount of sound, but they do cut down on the volume. Harmon mute is probably the softest out of all of these. Made of metal, completely wrapped with a cork. Tone is clear, edgy in quality. Notice that this has a stem at the bottom. This could be stem in or stem out. So normally you'll say, if you use the Harmon mute, you'll say stem in. So Harmon mute, stem in or stem out. You want to decide which you want. If you want the old-fashioned kind of 1920s sound, you would want stem in. If you want more of a Miles Davis 1950s, 1960s sound, that's stem out. And the bucket mute, literally, it looks like a bucket that's attached. This allows a good amount of sound to come out. And actually, there are quite a lot of different kinds of mutes. It's a whole world of mutes once you get into this, but I would stick with those 3 or 4 most popular. The plunger mute. This is great if you want that wah-wah sound. How do you notate that? The wah-wah, if the open sound is wah and the closed sound woo, right? That would be the plus notation. So you put the O for open and the plus for close. Wah, wah. All right. If you're not sure what exactly you want, you can just say play with plunger ad libitum. Okay, and or use a wavy line indication. Okay, and there you have it, the world's fastest walk through the brass choir and some basics of producing sound and how you should balance between the instruments. So we'll get into each one specifically, but this gives you a good head start in the choir. So once again, feel free to reach out anytime, and we'll keep our education going. All right, take care, everyone. See you soon.